My name's Tom Sego. I'm co-founder, CEO of BlastWave, and I'm here with a couple folks. Why don't you introduce yourselves?
Hi, Shaun, CEO of UTSI. We're a 41-year-old SCADA integrator and OT cybersecurity company.
Frank Benton with UTSI, Vice President, Business Development.
Zach, UTSI, OT cybersecurity practice lead.
Joe Baxter, Solutions Architect at BlastWave.
Okay, let's get started. So we're going to spend the next 25 to 30 minutes talking about what happened with the Minnesota Water Authority attacks, why it happened, and then what we're going to do about it. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Shaun to talk about the first slide and how there's a pattern that's been going on here for quite a while.
Thank you, sir. So I think it's interesting to look at the dates, the 2013 date, and one thing that you'll see on all of these, they all have the same theme, which is it's not a super sophisticated attack. There was no supercomputer cracking cryptography. It wasn't a sophisticated team behind it necessarily, or maybe they're sophisticated, but the actual exploit was not. And the time you can see the escalation since 2013. And my anecdotal experiences in 2013, we had an exploit. It was a Chinese-Iranian exploit in the oil and gas sector, and a handful of companies were finding the same exploit, and the FBI actually got involved to tell us about it at the same time that the IRGC had gotten access to a US controlled dam using the same vulnerabilities. And like you were saying, Tom, about the architecture, the process control network was never designed historically to have internet-facing communications. And so they've exploited that capability because that's probably 80% or more of all infrastructure has that legacy system behind that firewall. And so you can see the escalation in 2023. It was exponential, and those were looking for one specific type of PLC. And I happen to be inside of an operator, a water authority. And the problem that we've seen is 90% of the budget for most critical infrastructure asset owners, most of their budget actually goes to IT. And the argument that we were having at the time was, why would I fund all this when most of my attacks are on the IT? And the reality is, IT attacks are somebody usually looking for money, and they're targeting asset or monetarily valuable assets that are going to be able to cough up that money through some kind of ransomware or something of that nature. When you see people moving into the OT, they're not really going after money. They're looking to bring down critical infrastructure and hamper a nation, their ability to respond or produce. And water is one of those areas that has so many supply chain dependencies that are just really not that well mapped. And so you can look at nuclear facilities, oil and gas refineries, they all have, and then municipalities are taking from these large water authorities as well. So all kinds of products, power gen, they all have heavy dependency on water. And you can see the increase over the last 5 years is exponentially more than in the past, 20, and all the way up till this recent exploit, which was in the first few days, I believe it was 7 states, and then over the next week, it crawled out to about 12 states. And again, not using any real sophisticated techniques, but going after very basic vulnerabilities that you can find online, and junior cybersecurity person could exploit.
Yeah, and I think the point you also bring up about how water is critical infrastructure, and it's really a national critical infrastructure issue because it is undergirding a lot of these new capabilities that we're seeing launched today. Water is a huge component along with power for data centers and AI. The other thing I would say is that critical infrastructure, in my opinion, should not be left up to these municipal water authorities to defend themselves against these state actors. I mean, this is a national security issue. Critical infrastructure is a national security issue, not a municipal issue. And so we need coordinated effort between the municipalities, states, and the federal government so that we have a comprehensive approach. So I'm going to move to the next slide. Well, before I move that, I'll just say the technique got simpler, not harder. And I think one of the things we haven't talked about is how AI is automating and amplifying a lot of these existing threat vectors. So water has been a proving ground, and I think this helps these state actors demonstrate and learn capabilities that they can apply to other sectors, and it can be used in an asymmetric fashion for warfare. While people are spending millions, even billions of dollars on kinetic warfare, this kind of warfare is very cheap on a relative basis, and it can be very disruptive to the American public and sow discontent. So these are just some other examples. The Bowman Avenue Dam was a big deal back 13 years ago, and you can see that it took like 8 years before there was another really major event with the Oldsmar Water Authority plant attack in Florida, which was a relatively minor thing. It was just taking advantage of team viewers' remote access credentials on an unsupported operating system, but it did actually reach the public consciousness through the press. And since then, there hasn't been as much press about it, but there's been a lot more damaging attacks. And in the past year, for example, you're seeing the reason there's so many water authorities compromised with the Minnesota attack is, again, because AI makes it so easy to perform the reconnaissance, to find the vulnerabilities or find the weaknesses and exploit them. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. Just pointing out that none of these required an exploit. So what is confirmed today? We've had at least 12 states with reported incidents. Minnesota alone had 30. And there are 3 vendors that are in scope of this, and Zach's going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. And I just wanted to say the good news is, as Shaun mentioned, we've had relatively few boil water notices. We also had a few plants have to move to manual operations, which they were able to do. And there was some flooding, some loss of pressure. So the impacts and consequences have been relatively contained, but I think that's maybe a function of luck more than anything else. So I'm going to turn it over to Zach to talk about the IRGC and one of these threat actor groups that's been responsible for a lot of this activity.
Yeah, so I think we know that Iran, this group is a state-sponsored group, and they've been around since 2020. Really active. I think really within the last 3 years, trying to exploit things, and water critical infrastructure is one of them. And like everybody before said, it's really been an eye opener or it should have been an eye opener to say, hey, this is just the beginning, because it does feed into so many different areas. They are state sponsored, so they got money, and then using the same software that we've used for years, right? Programming our PLCs, our RTUs. And so it's not a sophisticated attack. It wasn't something that had to be thought out or well, extremely thought out. But it's there were no exploits. They didn't use malware. They used the same software that we use today to program our equipment. And obviously, there's no CVE because it wasn't something that they exploited through the application. It was simply because it was directly connected to the internet and had default passwords. It doesn't even take a script kiddie to figure that out.
That is huge. So, that's the part I hope everybody's aware of, that a lot of those sophisticated tools that people have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on don't address this issue. There's no CVE that caused this. Yeah,
exactly. It's not something that you could go out to the dark web and pick off the cart and add, and have somebody exploit it or build the exploit for you. It's just there. Default passwords is probably the easiest in all of the toolkit, right? Is to just go through and find devices and start plugging in the default passwords, 1 2 3 4 5 or whatever, yep. Right? So it's not sophisticated.
And these 3 PLC companies, Rockwell, Schneider, and Siemens, like These vulnerabilities, these risks exist today. They haven't been patched. They're not closed. So water authorities and other groups are still using these, are still impacted by this. So then the question,
Yeah.
Zach, is kind of why wasn't this caught?
Well, because they were just logging in as normal. There wasn't something that could trigger something other than, if they're really paying attention, looking at the logs when people were logging in, or why were people logging in, kind of thing. There was nothing there to really look for other than a valid logon, because you got the default password, and it's not anomalous. It's a regular user, logging in, even though it's the default with the default password. Um, you know, no intermediary, right, with a remote access tool that you have to authenticate through, and then get to your systems, right? So there's um, nothing to prevent it, because it's directly connected to the internet.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's no air gap. I mean, I've been to a couple of companies where that's what their saving grace was, is they were compromised on the business side, and then there was no way to get to the OT network, because it wasn't even plugged in to anything. It was its own isolated network that you had to physically go to a different machine to get to.
Yeah.
And the firewall is not going to protect you, because you're allowing remote access into those devices. So there's nothing there to prevent. It doesn't care, unless you put some rules in that said you can only access from this range of addresses or whatever. But most companies don't, either because they don't have the skill sets, or some sort of managed service, or know how they would want to restrict that, right?
Mm-hmm. But I do think that CISA's own mitigation was to say you need to remove discoverability. So Joe, why don't you talk a little bit about what we might be able to do about it, and what the start of a solution might be, or what a basic framework might look like.
Right. Well, I think, Tom, you've said many times that just about every exploit or any data breach you've ever heard of is also involves a firewall. And so the interesting thing about firewalls, and I say this in our demos quite often, is that a firewall is essentially a router traditionally with security on top. And a router is built to promulgate data between networks. And so if you put me on a network, I can find a firewall. I may not be able to get through it, but I can find it. And that just answers that question of what is discoverable on this network. I believe Charles said it just a moment ago that they're not changing passwords. I was a NERC auditor from 2008 on, and with federal regulatory backing, that power behind me, and we wrote many violations, and many of those default passwords, many of those violations were really essentially a default password that had never been changed. So you've got things that answer, you've got default passwords, you've got thousands and thousands and thousands of devices in this population. It's very difficult to control that level of complexity. Therefore, it's better if they just simply don't exist. They don't answer to a query. They don't respond except to authenticated, verified, and quite frankly, encrypted traffic. And so there's a kind of a watershed moment here where traditional networks have connected
Nice
first
one.
and
Nice
authenticated
pun there.
secondly. Huh? Oh,
Nice
well,
pun.
actually, thanks. Thanks. Unintentional, but achieved. But things connect first and then authenticate second. Networks, to protect themselves, need to authenticate first and then connect. And so, one of the things that Blast Shield does very effectively is provide this cloaking so that things can't be found by unauthenticated actors. That includes the passwordless access and the ability to actually control not just that north-south cloaking, but also east-west microsegmentation, stuff that doesn't go through the network, stuff that's already inside the network. These devices, these hosts can't talk to each other, so that malware can't propagate. That bad actor can't just bounce to the next device, to the next device, to the next device.
Yeah, and it deploys as a software overlay, so it doesn't.
Correct.
You get the network you want with the network you have, so you don't have to spend a bunch of money and do a whole redesign on your network, which I think is also
Exactly.
really powerful, because a lot of rural water authorities and water authorities in general do not have the capital that a lot of these larger organizations have. So you have to kind of get to the minimum viable security stack. So what would have changed on July 26th with this approach, Joe?
Well, fundamentally, they're logging in with default passwords. They're using things that are answering on the network. So if you scan a network and nothing's there, you're not just have a really strong lock on the door. You don't just have a security camera on the door. The door doesn't exist. It's hard to attack a door that simply isn't there. So the PLCs don't answer. Studio 5000 on its various ports. It doesn't render any type of access. There's no attack surface there to gain because it doesn't exist. It doesn't respond to your unauthenticated traffic. And when there's no password to guess, it doesn't matter if you have the default password. Try any of them. There's nothing to apply that password against, again, if the device simply doesn't answer, if that network isn't there. And, of course, if you can't connect, you can't see it, you can't establish a session.
Yep. Okay. And so that stops the first hop. Therefore, you can't get to the second hop. So,
Exactly.
So Shaun, let's talk about, before we say what we recommend doing and what CISA's guidance recommends doing, let's talk about what not to do. What do you think is the first thing that shouldn't be done here?
Ironically, nothing. The first thing is a lot of people say, well, we've never been hacked. And again, most of the stuff happens on the IT. So let's continue to focus on the IT. And they say we're too small or, we've never had an issue before. So they do nothing. And then number two is we've seen this happen over and over and over again where somebody gets scared, something does happen, and they go out and they hire a company, spend a ton of money, and the company provides them just a ton of information overload. It shows them that one PLC has 4,000 CVEs and scares everybody. And so they focus on the CVEs, but they don't focus on the basics, which I think somebody in the chat talked about basic cyber hygiene. That, like IEC 62443, there's a lot of conversations around post-quantum cryptography and all these fancy tools that are coming and these exploits that are going to happen. This is, again, not a sophisticated attack. And what you need to do now is totally different. And focusing on CVEs and focusing on the shiny toys or getting overwhelmed by information is not the right response. There are simple ways to approach this. And of course, you don't want to ignore CVEs, but you want to have somebody that understands the overall architecture and what CVEs are relevant based on what you have in place to protect you against those potential exploits.
Yeah, and I would just say, again, just thinking about requirements, you want this to be, I call it minimum viable security stack. So you want it to be very simple. You want it to be fast to deploy, easy to operate, not requiring hiring of additional headcount, so it's inexpensive, and ultimately you want to make sure it works. And we've been there, done that. Water is our largest sector as a company, and we've been deployed in 5,000 locations in 23 countries with 600 million device hours under our belt, and we've never had a successful breach against any of our customers. So it does take more than one vendor. This is not a single vendor solution. So Shaun, why don't you walk us through, now that you've talked about what not to do, what should they do, and what are the ABCs around this?
Sure. They have, there's a lot of noise out there right now, and I think people watching the news are getting inundated with information and buzzwords. But at the end of the day, yes, CISA has some free tools that you can use to do an assessment, but you need to know what you're assessing. And somebody that has been trained that understands what OT is supposed to look like, what a good OT cyber posture looks like, you want them to come in to use those tools, map that out, prioritize what you need to do, and then you need to build and remediate based on what you've seen and what's actually deployed in your environment. And then you go into a continuous monitoring because things change in OT. People are swapping stuff out all the time, physical things. It's not all the time, especially the smaller, older facilities, but things change. And you want to make sure you have continuous monitoring. So if there's a new device that enters that, maybe somebody has sold you a fancy new sensor and they want to be able to communicate to that sensor, they'll break some of your rules to be a good vendor for you so that you can get access to it. So you want somebody or in your team or as a managed service continually monitoring those assets for you.
Yeah, and the first item is CISA's first mitigation You can do a free Shodan scan, ping sweep, looking for external facing subnets. You can check firewall rules and logs a multitude of ways. So there's a lot of things you can do for free on that assessment front. There's also partners like UTSI who have deep experience. They've been there, done that. So you can, try to fix the car yourself, or you can just take it into the shop where UTSI has fixed thousands of these cars before. So this is the next to last slide. And I apologize that it's an eye chart, but it's trying to take the concepts that Shaun just walked through and try to look at this through the lens of a traditional approach, IT kind of focused stack versus a more simplified stack. And we're taking as an example, this is just an example. We're looking at a water authority, water treatment facility that has about 100 endpoints, 3 wells, and 25 lift stations with no dedicated security staff. And so the traditional stack is some combination of firewalls, VPNs, an OT security service, cloud logging, managed logging, continuous monitoring and visibility tools, as well as engineering and headcount. And the cost is like triple what it is in this more minimum style, where the customer has to integrate 5 different consoles, manage 5 different products, 5 different renewals, versus a much simpler thing where you have 4 functions, 1 console, and 1 MSSP. And the time to deploy for this firewall kind of approach is, we've heard between 6 months and 2 years. So it can depend, and all this, your mileage may vary based on the architecture of your site. And then in terms of efficacy, the sad thing is none of this removes the target. So what Joe and Zach talked about in terms of removing your discoverability, this doesn't even affect that. And so that's the biggest issue of spending all this money and not getting a good result. Whereas with this novel approach, which we would love to work with you and see what this could look like in your environment. And I'll point out this is kind of fine print. I'm sorry, it's like 12-point or 14-point font here. But UTSI not only does assessments, but they also can help with grant applications. Shaun, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the grants that have been applied for and received to help these rural water authorities get funding?
Sure. So I think just to highlight your point here, the traditional model is often based on the hazardous material companies that have been doing this for a long time. So when we came out and would do these assessments, we were taking that framework, and it was a long assessment, cost a lot of money, and the remediation was very expensive, and it increased overhead and burden on the company. And we have pivoted, realizing that that's not realistic. The time frame and the increased burden, administrative overhead, is just not something that the water authorities and the municipalities can bear. So a lot of times they can't afford the assessment, or they can't afford as thorough of an assessment as what we would have done historically. And then we've been able to tailor that down by partnering with companies like BlastWave and other tools to help get our assessment costs down, our time to assess down, the quality of the assessment up, and turn that around much more quickly than the traditional model that we were using back in the day. And then the ongoing support model is much cheaper, does not increase admin burden on the operator side, but increases their security posture and their awareness of what's going on in the field. So on the grants, it has been really one of those things we've been preaching from the mountaintops for the last 4 years. I came in doing engineering data management with water, but never cybersecurity until 2022. And I was just genuinely shocked. And I felt like it was part of our job to help bring that cost and the time to remediate down. And a lot of that, there have been grants released this year. And we've seen small municipalities get up to $300,000 to $500,000 to help remediate these. So there's federal, state, local, and water-specific grants that are available. And obviously, it helps to write these with people that own the asset, so they're going to get more attention, and the money is sitting there. You just got to ask for it. And so we've seen people get more money than they actually need, and have some nice to haves added to that. But as far as the MVP, you could cover your MVP costs for a true secure system just through the grants that are available.
Yeah. And I'll point out waterwatchcenter.org is an organization that's also helping craft a reference architecture that helps address some of the IT deficiencies, and that they're running that through some MSSP partners. And the beautiful thing about this is it takes weeks instead of, months. And again, the target is removed. So in terms of efficacy, you go from having all these vulnerabilities that are never going to be patched, having these exposed internet facing things, which may be difficult to remove, and some of which you may not even know about because people made dual home PCs so they can get remote access or engineering workstations. There's all kinds of shenanigans that lead to unanticipated gaps in your architecture. If there's anything I want you to walk away with from this talk, it's that none of this required a CVE. None of this required an exploit. It just had a controller that was visible and could answer the call. So with that, we'll take a look at some questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Let's see, does anybody have any, can you guys read off some of the questions that we may have gotten in the chat?
Yeah, I've got one here that the question came in about BlastWave providing, firewall, IDS, IPS, monitoring, logging, and alerting within the gateway. So that's kind of a nuanced question. So first, I want to say that, some of that analysis and some of that monitoring would be under in the guise of UTSI and some of that stuff. But traditionally, what we do as BlastWave is we do something that is actually somewhat unique in the industry, is that we provide the protection. It's not just a detection and something like that. It's actually some protection. So, and we're different than the usual IPS approach, which can cause SCADA interruptions, can prevent polls, can, potentially prevent set points from being pushed out, things like that. We are a deny by default zero trust technology that if it matches the policy, that's the only way the communication goes through. So that's where the analysis of UTSI and other systems like that can come in and tell you what is good, and then we enforce that.
Let me just pile on, Joe, on one other,
Yeah.
just boil down what you said into one word, and it's called prevention.
Yep.
But what we're focused on is prevention and the detection of anomalies and things like that, triaging and prioritizing those alerts, sending them to a security operations center where people have to triage this thing, has been an effective approach in the past. But with AI, the time allowed between discovery and exploit has gone from 10 months to 9 hours, and that's going to 0. So the time that you have to remediate this is shrinking every day, which puts an emphasis on this prevention issue around discoverability, which is why I'm screaming from the mountaintops, much like Shaun is around the grant things, that we need to be taking a prevention mindset, cloak these networks first, and then you can start processing all of the weaknesses that are in the underlying architecture.
Did you want to read out the next question, Joe, or you want me to? What can the federal government do to help support states or communities, CI organizations with fewer resources to improve their cyber practice? And then obviously, otherwise, they're going to go for the weakest link. And I think Shaun mentioned it with the grants and stuff, but, they have the MS, which is multi-state ISACs that are doing awareness programs, and you can go to the website and get that information. But Shaun, is there anything else that
Yeah, so especially for smaller assets, there's grants set aside, and this is Texas specific, but the Texas Water Development Board has small rural disadvantaged grants specifically for that reason to bring in an MSSP. So they're looking at not only the upfront assess and remediate, but the long-term run and maintain. And that's built into the grant so that you would have to reapply after 3 or 4 years, whatever the grant allocated. But that's why the funds are a little bit higher on those. And then you'll get some that have grant forgiveness. So you can do a clean water grant, and then that's a CISA backed grant. So once you prove yourself and you go through the checks, then you essentially don't have to pay that grant back. So a handful of the grants require you to pay them back, but CISA has partnered with DOE and the TCEQ, which is like the DOE for Texas, to help remediate that cost or to mitigate it altogether.
Joe, do you want to read the next question and talk about the approach to passwords, overlays, and discoverability?
Sure. Yeah, the question is, regulating things like forcing default password changes inherently in the devices may not solve the problem, but would be helpful. And I saw that quite a bit. When I joined the electrical sector, I was commenting here earlier that, in 2008, I laughed at the NERC CIP standards. I thought they were silly because I came from the banking world. But I didn't realize that inch deep cybersecurity actually was a mile wide, and the huge lift of just changing passwords to these tens of thousands of devices that all have to operate perfectly, or a SCADA system comes crashing down. You got to stop because you don't know where the robot is, the generator is, or the water pump is. These things are important. And so enforcing that change is a huge multi-year process. Whereas if you just hide that, if you render the device undiscoverable, that effectively mitigates a lot of that, whether you remembered to change the password, whether you actually did change that password or not. Having it behind something that renders it undiscoverable is an excellent way to mitigate a lot of that risk.
Yeah. Yeah, we actually ran there was a story of one customer actually used us to protect a very large application. And the thing that we did is we gave away everybody, here's the username and password to access this application. Okay, now try to attack it. Now you've got the password, which can be brute forced or can be stolen or socially engineered. You've got the username and password now, have at it. And they couldn't get started because the ingress port was whitelisted through an overlay. So you had to authenticate to the overlay first before you could even use that known username and password. And that's an extra level of defense in depth that can mitigate that risk, because it's all about mitigating risk. It's not about having perfect security.
Right.
All right. Any other questions that I think we've answered the questions in the chat. Any other final comments, closing comments that you guys want to share that we didn't cover?
I was going to post go ahead, Shaun.
Sorry, Zach. I just think it's important, if you know anybody that is, and I think this video is going to get shared. I know from me and a few others are going to send this out to, I've been receiving a bunch of inquiries on this. I was really excited to get everyone together and get this thought leadership out there. But the cost to remediate is one side of it. The cost to operate is another. So whenever you're doing your assessment, look at what the total cost is going to be to the organization and what the lift is. And then on the right side of that is, the idea of like Tom was talking about, running offline, running manually. That is something that should be part of your business continuity plan, your incident response plan. And a lot of smaller organizations just don't have the know-how or the time to do that. So if you're going out for a grant, go ahead and add that in there so that you can have tabletops and drills and response plans built and all the operators trained so that you know what the total cost of operation is going to be and how to remediate in the case of an event.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'll just close with saying that this is scary. The world is changing dramatically. The geopolitical risk we are seeing today is unlike anything I've seen in my lifetime. The tooling that adversaries have, not even state-sponsored adversaries, individual bad guys and girls have very sophisticated tools now. AI is making that even worse. And so by taking a kind of a relatively simple approach, by removing the target, if you can remove the target, it doesn't matter whether it's a human adversary that's sophisticated or not. It doesn't matter if it's an AI adversary. If you remove the target, it really provides a level of protection that's going to help us all sleep better at night. So with that, thank you guys, panelists, for being with us today. Zach, Joe, Shaun, Kelly, Cam, thank you guys so much for this. And if you guys have questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm on LinkedIn. My email is tom@blastwave.com. And Shaun and I work together very closely, and we can help you guys protect your water authorities and your communities. So thank you.